The river looked different on days like this. It was the same water it had always been, gray-green, moving slow through the bend where the old industrial lot used to be, the surface catching the October light in small, flat pieces. But today there were tents along its edge. White ones, the kind with clear sides and soft lighting inside. There were camera rigs and tripods and drones idling on their pads and a red carpet running from a temporary parking structure down to a viewing stage that had been bolted together over 3 days. Catering staff moved in clean black uniforms. A string quartet played something no one was listening to. And at the center of all of it, behind a silk-draped form that was still covered as the guests arrived, sat the car. Nobody had seen it yet outside a few carefully managed teasers, a wheel arch, a headlight in silhouette, the reflection of a runway in a door panel. But the room knew what it was. The Aurora RS1? 1,200 horsepower. $3 million per unit. 42 units worldwide. Every person standing on that riverside terrace holding a champagne flute knew they were in the presence of something designed to be the most expensive thing in any room it entered. Daniel Mercer pulled in through the service access at 9:47 a.m. His truck was a 2001 diesel, dark blue in its original panels and rust red everywhere else, with a replacement front bumper that didn't match and a rear bed fitted with equipment most of the guests couldn't have named. It came to a stop in the area designated for subcontractors and facilities personnel, a gravel patch set back from the main event, separated from the exhibition by a low temporary fence and a set of directional signs nobody had thought to remove. Daniel stepped out in work boots and a faded green jacket, a clipboard under one arm. His daughter Lily climbed down from the passenger side with her backpack on and found a piece of gravel to kick. She was 7. She had her father's patient eyes and her mother's habit of cataloging the world quietly before deciding what to make of it. Daniel had been contracted by the event's third-party facilities company to inspect and certify 3 temporary generator connections powering the exhibition's lighting grid. It was a 3-hour job, maybe 4. He had done it 100 times at venues like this and had never once appeared on a guest list. He did not mind this. He had packed Lily's sandwich with the crust off and had her homework folder in the truck and knew they would be home before her spelling test practice ran late. He was 3 minutes into his inspection when the laughter started. It came from a cluster of guests near the champagne station, 5 men and 2 women, corporate by the look of them, the kind of dressed-down expensive that takes real money to achieve. One of them, a tall man with gray at his temples and the posture of someone who expected rooms to orient toward him, had turned to look at Daniel's truck. He said something to the group that Daniel couldn't fully hear, but the shape of it was clear enough. The man's voice carried when he finished. "That thing belongs in a scrapyard, not beside innovation." The group laughed. One of the women shook her head in theatrical agreement. One of the others took a photo on his phone, not of the Aurora, not of the river. Of the truck. Lily heard all of it. She was standing 8 feet from Daniel, holding her backpack straps with both hands, and she didn't say anything. She didn't look at the men who laughed. She looked at the gravel, the way children do when they are absorbing something they haven't yet decided how to carry. Daniel continued his inspection without turning around. He noticed her hand first. She had been holding the backpack strap loosely, the way she held it when she was comfortable, when the day was going fine and she was simply waiting for the next part of it. Now her knuckles were pale against the nylon. Both hands. She was looking at the gravel with the specific stillness of a child deciding whether to cry and choosing not to. Daniel set the clipboard down on the truck's running board. He crossed to her in 4 steps and crouched until he was level with her face, which was the way he always did it, not reaching down to her, not pulling her up to him, but coming to where she was. She didn't look at him immediately. He gave her a second. Then he reached up and wiped a smudge of something from just below her left cheekbone. Dust, probably, or the remnant of the chocolate chip granola bar she'd eaten on the drive over. He used his thumb the way he always did, once, sure and gentle. "You've got your word list in the folder?" he asked. She nodded, still not looking up. "The hard ones are on the back page this week. The ones with the silent letters." She glanced up at him then, just briefly, The quick check children do when they're trying to understand whether an adult has noticed what they noticed. His expression was the same as it always was, calm, attentive, not performing anything. "Why do they say things like that?" she asked. She said it quietly, not pointed. Just an honest question. Daniel looked at her for a moment. "They see the outside of something and decide they already know what it is. People do that. It's rude." "It is," he said. No argument from him. No qualifier, no gentle revision. It was rude. He wasn't going to tell her otherwise. He stood up, picked up the clipboard, and handed her a small container of apple slices from the front seat. "We've got about 2 more hours here. You can work on the word list while I finish the generator check, and then we're going home before the traffic gets bad." Lily took the apple slices and sat on the running board. She was quiet for a moment, watching the corporate guests across the temporary fence line, the champagne and the cameras and the silk-draped shape on the stage that everyone was pretending not to stare at. "Dad," she said. "Yeah. Why don't you ever tell people what you used to do? Like your real job?" Daniel finished writing something on the inspection form before he answered. His pen moved with precision, the practiced shorthand of someone who had filled out field reports for years. "Some things don't need saying unless they're needed," he said. Lily chewed an apple slice and thought about this. "What if they're needed?" He looked at her. One corner of his mouth moved barely. "Then they get said?" He picked up his toolkit and walked back toward the generator housing. Lily opened her homework folder and found the word list with the silent letters. She ran her finger along the first row, lips moving slightly, testing each one against what she remembered. Behind her, through the fence, the event moved in its polished orbit. Cameras. Champagne. Laughter that cost nothing to produce. She did not look up from the word list. He had named it after his wife. That wasn't precisely true. Mara had named it after herself, or after the version of herself she was in the years before the diagnosis, when she had a habit of giving names to things that frustrated her, and then forgiving them anyway. The old coffee maker. The drafty corner of their first apartment. The diesel truck she drove once, stalled twice, and declared clearly mine, while Daniel stood in the driveway in the rain trying not to laugh. He had kept the name after she was gone. He had also kept the truck, which was the more complicated choice. In the 18 months after Mara died, when Lily was 4 and the world had a quality of unreality that Daniel had stopped expecting to resolve, he had rebuilt it from the frame up. Not because it needed a full rebuild, it didn't, but because he needed something with parameters. Something with tolerances he understood. Something that broke in ways he knew how to fix. He had started with the frame rails, reinforcing the central cross members and rear attachment points with welded plate. He had mounted a hydraulic winch on a fabricated front cradle, rated for 12,000 pounds and rigged with a custom fairlead that allowed deployment at non-standard angles. He had added a PTO interface, power takeoff from the transfer case, that could drive the winch under zero electrical load, which mattered when the batteries were dead or the terrain had cut the alternator. He had built in dual battery isolation, a secondary hydraulic pump routed to a rear winch mount, and anchor point rings welded at 3 positions on the rear frame that could accept a total static load the truck's own chassis could not exceed. The cooling system was rebuilt entirely. So was the braking system. The suspension was lifted and resprung with coils rated for the additional recovery equipment weight. None of this was visible from outside. From outside, Mara looked like what she was, a 23-year-old truck with mismatched panels, rust along both wheel wells, and a rear bumper that had been replaced with something fabricated rather than manufactured. She looked like a vehicle held together by stubbornness and good intentions. Guests at the Riverside event had looked at her the way people look at things they consider beneath acknowledgement. A brief glance, a small dismissal, the subconscious decision that nothing about this object required further thought. Daniel had designed it that way. Partially. He had not made Mara look rough because he was careless. He had made peace with her looking rough because appearances were not the point, and spending money on the point of her was the only spending that mattered. He had finished the rebuild in the second year after Mara died, working evenings in the single-car garage of the house he and Lily shared, with talk radio on low and Lily asleep in the room above. He had used the same engineering discipline that had once governed field recovery operations across flood zones, bridge collapses, and mountain rescue corridors, systems he had designed for regional disaster response teams, vehicle recovery protocols that were still, as far as he knew, incorporated into training manuals he had never been credited for. He had walked away from that work 3 years before Mara died. He had stepped back from the firm when the travel became unsustainable, and the home front became the thing that needed him. He had not regretted it. He had stayed in the field in a reduced way, taking the kind of work that let him be home for dinner and spelling tests, and the school plays where Lily performed with the slightly wrong level of confidence that he found completely endearing. The work he did now was quieter. Facilities. Maintenance. Generator certification. Things that kept infrastructure running, done by people nobody photographed. He was thinking about none of this as he walked the riverbank perimeter at 10:15 a.m., inspection clipboard in hand. He was thinking about the soil. It had rained the previous night. Not heavily, a 4-hour steady fall, the kind that soaks in slowly and doesn't announce itself in the morning. The ground along the bank showed it. The surface was firm enough to walk on, but there was give beneath the top 2 inches, a softness that moved slightly under pressure. The temporary crowd barriers had been staked into this softened ground and were seated shallower than their specifications assumed. Daniel stopped at the place where the temporary launch ramp met the bank edge, pressed the toe of his boot into the soil, and looked at the angle. He wrote a note on the back page of his inspection form. Then he kept walking, because it wasn't his job to say anything yet. But he would be watching. His name was Preston Vale, and he had the specific energy of a man who managed things he did not understand. He was regional director for Luxon Automotive's event and brand division, a title that meant, in practice, that he controlled what the Aurora launch looked and felt like from the moment investors and influencers arrived until the moment the press releases went out. He was 41, expensively tailored, and had a way of looking at spaces and identifying, within seconds, what was wrong with the picture. He spotted Daniel's truck at 10:28 a.m. It was parked legally, in the designated subcontractor area, exactly where the facilities company had been told to park. It was not near the camera line, was not inside the event perimeter, and was not within 30 feet of the Aurora display stage. But it was visible, from the secondary press position, from the drone footage zone, and from the angle where Luxon's in-house content team had positioned a long-lens camera to catch wide establishing shots of the waterfront setup. Preston walked to the nearest security coordinator, a young man named Marcus who was doing his job without complaint. "The diesel truck in the subcontractor lot," Preston said without greeting. "It needs to move." Marcus checked his tablet. "That's a facilities vehicle. They're contracted for the generator inspection. Mr. Mercer is about halfway through the certification run. It's in the shot envelope. It's in the designated." "Marcus." Preston said it with a particular patience that wasn't patience. "Do you understand what a shot envelope is?" Marcus understood. He walked to find Daniel. Daniel listened to the request without changing expression. He explained, clearly and without hostility, that the truck carried the diagnostic equipment required for the generator inspection, that moving it would require pausing the certification, and that the certification needed to be completed before the main power load test at 12:30 p.m. He offered to reposition by 6 feet if that resolved the angle concern. Marcus relayed this to Preston. Preston walked over himself. He stopped in front of Daniel with the slightly too wide stance of someone who was performing authority for invisible observers. He looked at the truck. He looked at Daniel, the faded jacket, the worn boots, the inspector's clipboard. He looked at the truck again. "Move it to the far service access," Preston said. "Past the maintenance barrier. The generator housing is on this side of the barrier," Daniel said. "I need a cable run of about 200 feet to complete the diagnostics from that position. I don't have that equipment with me today. Then do what you can from over there. I can't certify the connections from over there. That's the job. Preston turned slightly, as if appealing to an audience. Two of his marketing staff had drifted over, phones loosely in hand. A couple of guests had paused nearby. You know, Preston said, his voice dropping into the performative reasonable tone that meant the conversation was over. I appreciate that you're doing your job. I really do. But there are engineers here today, real engineers, who have signed off on this setup. I don't need the maintenance team to lecture engineers about engineering. He smiled as he said it. Not at Daniel. At the ambient space around Daniel, for anyone watching. Daniel held his clipboard in both hands and said nothing. He looked at Preston for exactly one beat, not a challenging look, just the measuring kind, and then he looked down at his inspection form and made a notation. I'll be finished by 12, he said. Preston turned and walked back toward the stage. Lily had heard the exchange from her seat on the running board. She had the homework folder open on her knees but was not looking at it. She was watching her father's face. He did not look angry. He did not look embarrassed. He looked like a man who had written something down and was moving to the next item. She went back to the silent letters. By 11, the event was approaching its peak density. More guests had arrived. The press section was full and the drone operators had begun their pre-show flight checks, small white machines lifting to test hover altitude above the river, their cameras sweeping the bank in slow preview arcs. The Aurora was still under its silk cover, but the energy around it had shifted, that particular charged silence of a crowd that has been anticipating something long enough that the anticipation itself has become pleasurable. Daniel had finished 2 of the 3 generator certifications and was completing his documentation at the truck's tailgate. Lily sat in the passenger seat with the door open and her legs hanging out, eating the second half of her sandwich. He had cut the crusts off, as always. Can I have the chips now? She asked. After the homework words. She sighed in the way that communicated total injustice. Then she opened the folder. He checked the time on his watch, the analog one, the one that had been Mara's father's, and noted she had been in the truck for nearly 90 minutes. He reached behind the seat and found the thin fleece blanket she used on long drives and on the late shifts when she fell asleep waiting for him, and he folded it into a better shape and set it on the seat beside her. She pulled it over her lap without being asked. Dad, she said, running her finger along the word list. Yeah. Is the fancy car better than our truck? He was writing something on his inspection form. He finished the notation before he looked up. Better at what? Just better. Like better. He considered this seriously, the way he considered most of her questions. They're built for different things. That car over there, he nodded toward the covered Aurora on its stage, is built to be extraordinary. To be looked at, to go very fast, to make the person sitting in it feel like they're somewhere else. What's ours built for? Daniel looked at the truck. At Mara's rust-patched flanks, the worn tread on the rear tires, the hydraulic winch sitting quiet under its forward cradle. Bringing people home, he said. Lily chewed her sandwich and thought about that. Behind them, the event infrastructure was completing its final configuration. The Aurora's temporary launch ramp extended from the display stage down toward the river access slope, a 40-foot platform on hydraulic levelers, designed to let the car roll forward under its own autonomous navigation as a demonstration of its terrain sensing capability. The setup had been approved by Luxon's event engineering team, a group whose expertise was predominantly in structural staging, visual design, and load-bearing calculation for static displays. Daniel had been watching the ramp since he arrived. The angle was wrong. Not dramatically wrong. It would not register as an obvious error to most observers. But the platform descent was set at a grade that assumed dry friction coefficients on the river access section. After the previous night's rain, that section was wet, compressed, and carrying significantly less grip than the survey team had measured 3 days ago. He had noticed this at 10:15. He had made a note. At 11:40, the junior event coordinator, a young woman with a clipboard and an earpiece, moving between stations with the distracted urgency of someone managing 17 things, came through the subcontractor area on her way to the generator station. Daniel stopped her. I have a concern about the launch ramp, he said. The bank grade on the river access section, it tested softer than your surveyed baseline after last night's rain. The angle is going to compound the braking distance on wet surface. She looked at him. Then at her clipboard. Are you with the rigging team? Facilities. Generator certification. The ramp was signed off by our engineering lead this morning. I know, Daniel said. I'm not questioning the sign-off. I'm saying the soil condition changed overnight, and the grade assumes dry contact on the lower section. She wrote something on her clipboard. I'll pass it along. She didn't. He could tell by the speed at which she moved on that his words had been absorbed into the general category of things that subcontracted workers say at events, a category that existed mainly to be noted and not escalated. He looked at the river. The surface had a slight chop on it now, the afternoon wind beginning to move across the open water from the north. He walked back to the truck and checked that Lily had finished the word list. She had. She was already on the chips. Through the open passenger window, they could hear the event MC warming up the crowd with opening remarks. The silk cover over the Aurora shifted in the river wind. The drone operators lifted their machines to operational altitude. Almost done, Daniel said. Lily nodded, watching the drones. They're pretty. Yeah, he said. They are. He looked at the ramp once more. At the bank. At the darkened soil at the water's edge. He took out his phone and tried the security supervisor's line. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. The reveal happened at noon. Preston Vale gave the introduction personally, which was his preference. He stood at the edge of the stage in his fitted presentation jacket and spoke for 7 minutes about the future of automotive engineering, the intersection of performance and sustainability, and Luxon's commitment to redefining what a driver could expect from a machine. It was a good speech. He had given versions of it 14 times in the past 2 years, and the cadence was polished to the point of invisibility. The silk came off the Aurora RS1 to a sound that was partly applause and partly something more involuntary. The small, collective inhale that expensive beautiful things produce in groups of people who are paid to appreciate them. It was, objectively, a remarkable object. Graphite body panels over a carbon structure, a front face that was more airful than hood, wheelhouses that seemed designed by someone who had studied predators. It sat low and still and said nothing, which is what cars worth $3 million are allowed to do. Daniel watched from the subcontractor area. Lily was beside him now, standing on the lower step of the truck's running board to see over the temporary fence. She had one hand loosely on the door mirror. It's really shiny, she said. It is. Does it go fast? Very. Faster than the train? Faster than most trains. She considered this and appeared to find it sufficient. The demonstration segment began at 12:18. The Aurora would navigate autonomously down the launch ramp under its own propulsion, minimal driver input, the car's terrain mapping system doing most of the work, its traction management responding to surface variables in real time. The whole sequence was designed to last 40 seconds. The car would descend the platform, arc left across the lower river access section, hold for a 10-second drone capture, and return to the stage under escort. The test driver climbed in. His name was Reeves, early 30s, company contracted, experienced with performance vehicles on closed courses. He had done 3 dry runs on a simulation rig and 1 in the staging bay. He had not driven the actual ramp under actual conditions, because the ramp had only been finalized the previous afternoon. Daniel stood very still. He had tried the security supervisor twice. He had spoken to the event coordinator. He had considered approaching Preston directly and had weighed, with the practiced realism of a man who understood institutional hierarchies, the exact probability that Preston would hear anything he said. He had assessed it at close to 0 after the morning's exchange. He had one more option, the fire safety officer posted at the eastern perimeter, a compact man in a white hard hat who had been standing near the bank barriers for 2 hours. Daniel walked to him. The ramp angle and the bank soil condition, Daniel said without preamble. Who signed off on the wet surface friction assessment? The fire officer looked at him. You're with facilities? Generator certification. But I've done recovery work on river access grades. The overnight rain changed the contact coefficient on the lower section. Your survey was from 3 days ago. The fire officer's expression shifted slightly. He looked toward the ramp, then back at Daniel. The engineering lead signed off this morning, he said. I wasn't part of that review. Can you call it in? Request a recheck before they roll? He reached for his radio. Static, then a voice, then another voice. He said something Daniel couldn't fully hear. He listened. He turned back. They're starting in 2 minutes. Engineering says it's within tolerance. Daniel looked at the ramp. At the grade. At the darkened soil where the platform met the riverbank. At the slight film of moisture on the lower section's surface that was invisible on the drone camera, but was completely apparent from 30 feet away at eye level. Stay by the barrier, he said to the fire officer. He walked back to the truck. Lily was still on the running board. He positioned himself between her and the ramp at a distance that looked casual but wasn't. The crowd quieted. The MC gave the signal. Reeves released the hold and the Aurora began to move. It lasted 11 seconds before it went wrong. The Aurora moved beautifully for the first portion of the descent, smooth, composed, the kind of motion that looks inevitable when everything is working correctly. The car's terrain sensors were reading the platform's surface and communicating to the traction management system with the millisecond precision the technology was designed to deliver. The crowd watched with the satisfied quiet of a group seeing something sophisticated perform. Then the front axle reached the transition point where the platform met the river access section. The soil there had been firm enough at 8 in the morning, when the site crew had done their final visual check. 3 hours later, with midday sun warming the surface layer and foot traffic having broken the top crust in 3 places, it was not. The terrain sensors read the surface correctly, or rather, they read the surface they were trained to expect, and the signal from soft, rain-saturated compacted soil read as something close enough to acceptable that the system's response was half a second behind where it needed to be. The car corrected. That was the trouble. It corrected, and the correction was right for the data it had, and the data was wrong. The rear outside tire found the softest section and broke through it, and the Aurora slid, not catastrophically, not even dramatically at first, just a lateral shift of perhaps 14 inches that, on a closed test track, would have been unremarkable. But 14 inches at the riverbank edge meant the rear outside tire was no longer on the platform. It was on the bank slope. And the bank slope was softer still, and wet, and angled at 3 degrees more than the platform. The car's system responded again, but the platform was no longer fully under it, and the logic that governed its recovery sequence assumed flat continuous surface, and the surface was either. The crowd laughed. This was the part that would stay with Daniel afterward, the 2-second laugh. Because the movement looked like a deliberate swerve, like a demonstration of dynamic handling, like something scripted. People with champagne glasses laughed with delight. Someone near the drone station began applauding. Then the Aurora's nose swung toward the water, and the rear dropped off the bank entirely, and the delight collapsed. Reeves understood what was happening before the sensors did. He applied manual override and full reverse, which was correct, but the rear tires had no traction on the saturated bank and the car's weight and the slope's angle had already committed the sequence. The Aurora slid sideways, dropped another 14 inches, and the nose went down. The water was cold and fast-moving near the bank, dark with silt. The Aurora went in nose first, the front third of the car submerging within 4 seconds, the doors sealing, the system trying to correct against a situation it had no protocol for. Reeves was trapped. The door seals were holding the car's architecture intact, but the nose was continuing to angle downward, the current pulling the front of the vehicle, and in 60 seconds the level would be above the door releases. The crowd was no longer laughing. Preston Vale stood at the edge of the stage. His face had the specific blankness of a person whose mental model of the day has been entirely overwritten. Around him, security began moving without direction. 2 drones veered away from the now dangerous bank edge. Someone was shouting for a phone. Someone else had already called, and was holding the phone at arm's length and saying nothing useful into it. The company's designated safety tow vehicle, a mid-size utility truck brought in for the demonstration, rated for incline recovery on dry paved surfaces, was positioned on the far side of the staging area. The driver was standing outside it, looking at the river, holding his keys. Daniel was already moving. Not running. Moving, with the specific pace of someone who has done urgent things in controlled sequences and knows that running introduces error. He reached Lily in 2 steps. "Stay in the truck," he said. "Belt on. Don't open the door until I come to you." He put Mara's emergency whistle, a small, orange aluminum thing that had lived in the glove box since Lily was 3, in her hand. He told her it was for if she needed him. She nodded, already buckled, eyes wide but not panicked. She had her father's ability to hold still when still was what was needed. Daniel was at the truck's controls in 4 seconds. Security reached him before he got the winch deployed. 2 of them, both young, both large, both doing their jobs with the earnest force of people who had been told to manage a perimeter and were now managing a perimeter in the middle of a crisis, which gave their authority a blunt, misdirected quality. "Sir, you need to stay clear. The car's going under in about 45 seconds, Daniel said. He was not looking at them. He was looking at the bank. "The driver has maybe 90 after that before the seal fails at current water temperature. You can stop me or you can get out of the way, but make the decision now." He said it the way he said most things, without heat, without performance, with the absolute directness of someone who has spent years making decisions under pressure and has no patience left for uncertainty. One of them stepped back. The other looked toward Preston. Preston was 30 feet away, phone in hand, saying something to a Luxon executive. He wasn't looking at Daniel. Both security personnel stepped back. Daniel assessed the bank in the time it took him to walk the truck into position, a low, careful roll of 15 feet, oriented so Mara's nose faced away from the water, her frame positioned at a deliberate angle. Not the obvious angle. The obvious angle was straight back from the sinking car, which would exert rotational force on the Aurora's submerged nose and risk rolling it. Rolling it meant the driver's door would be pinned against the bottom. He chose a rear-quarter approach, offset by 22 degrees. It would allow a controlled pull from below the car's center of gravity, tilting it up and back rather than rolling it sideways. He had done this calculation in 3 seconds because he had done variations of it for a decade. He opened the rusted side compartment on Mara's left flank. The guests who had begun moving toward the truck, not the security personnel, the civilian guests, the ones reaching for their phones, the ones who had been laughing, stopped and looked. Inside the compartment, coiled synthetic rope, yellow and blue. Soft shackles. A snatch block mounted on a bolt frame. Load-rated recovery straps folded in precise thirds. A secondary line, orange, coiled separately. A hydraulic remote that ran to the front winch. Professional grade. All of it. It was the gear of someone who had done this work seriously and for years. One of the guests lowered his phone. Daniel did not look at them. He moved the components to the bank with the efficiency of someone unpacking a kit they had configured themselves. Because he had. Because every position of every component had been chosen by him, in the garage, in the evenings, tested on terrain far worse than this riverbank. He spoke to the small crowd that had gathered within earshot, not for their benefit but for the responders who had arrived, 2 paramedics from the event medical station, the fire officer in the white hard hat, 1 security coordinator who had pulled out a radio. "The car needs to come out on the uphill side, not straight back. If we pull straight it pivots on the nose. The driver's door goes under." He spoke plainly, not fast. "I need 20 feet of clearance on the left flank for the secondary line. Nobody in that corridor." Nobody argued. He set the snatch block on the anchor post of the temporary barrier, one of the few correctly anchored ones, which he had identified that morning, and ran the winch line through it. He attached the recovery strap to the Aurora's tow point, which was recessed under the rear bumper and required knowing where to look. He found it in 4 seconds. "The battery compartment is forward sealed," he said, to no one in particular, and everyone within range. "If it goes further under the nose, you have a second problem. Don't wait for better equipment. This pull works if we do it now." He attached the secondary line and handed the free end to the fire officer, who took it without question. Then he climbed back into the truck, engaged the PTO, and looked at the bank one more time. The winch engaged with a sound like low machinery agreeing to do something difficult. The synthetic line went tight in a smooth pull, no jerk, no snap, the controlled build-up of a system designed to distribute load across its full geometry before asking anything of the anchor. Daniel had the PTO engaged at minimum output and was building it in increments, the way you build pressure on a wet ground pull, slowly enough to let the substrate respond, fast enough to beat the timeline. The crowd went quiet. Not silent, there was the river, the wind, the sound of the winch, distant shouting from the paramedics at the bank. But the social noise, the voices, the nervous laughter, the performance of concern, that went away. People stood and watched with the specific attention that comes when something real is happening, and they don't know how it ends. Several of them, Daniel knew, expected the truck to fail. He could feel it from the bank, the way you can feel a crowd's expectation when it's shared enough to become a kind of pressure. The rusted panels. The mismatched bumper. The rust-red wheel wells. Every visible quality of the truck said, "This will not be enough." Every visible quality of the truck was irrelevant. The line loaded. The snatch block seated. The Aurora shifted, barely, a degree of movement barely visible from the bank, and then it shifted again. The nose came up 3 inches. The current pushed against the front quarter and the winch answered it without complaint, because the winch had been sized for exactly this category of work and had been maintained to exactly this standard and had been positioned at exactly the correct angle. Mara's frame settled under the load. Not groaning, settling. The creak of a structure that has found its working point and is functioning within it. 2 inches more. The Aurora's driver door cleared the waterline. Daniel heard the emergency responders move, the sound of boots on gravel, the paramedics going forward with their equipment, voices becoming purposeful rather than urgent. He kept the winch running, slow, steady, holding the line's tension constant while the responders worked the door. It took 90 seconds from the first pull to Reeves getting his door open. It took 30 seconds more to get him out. He was wet and cold and shaken and he was alive, which was the only number that mattered in the accounting of the next several minutes. Daniel brought the Aurora up another 6 feet onto the bank, enough to secure it, enough to get the responders to both doors, and then eased the winch to a stop. He set the brake. He turned off the PTO. He sat in the cab for a moment. Then he got out and walked to the rusted side compartment, and began recovering his equipment. No one spoke to him for perhaps 30 seconds. The crowd was still doing the thing that crowds do in the aftermath of the thing they had just seen, the slow reorientation of understanding, the recalibration of who did what and what it meant. Someone, somewhere near the back of the group, began to clap. Not the applause of performance, not the applause of the event. Just one person's response to something that had happened in front of them. It spread. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't long, but it was real in the way that spontaneous things are real. Daniel coiled the secondary line. The fire captain arrived from the North Access Road 6 minutes after the pull. His name was Aldrin, and he had been in the city's heavy rescue division for 22 years, which meant he had seen river extractions, vehicle recoveries, and bridge collapses, and which meant that when he came through the temporary barrier and saw the Aurora on the bank with a synthetic recovery line still attached to a battered diesel truck, he understood in one pass what had happened and what it had required. He looked at the truck. He looked at the line rigging. He looked at Daniel, who was on one knee resetting the snatch block. "Mercer," he said. Daniel looked up. "Didn't know you were working events now." "Generator certification," Daniel said. "The other thing was an adjustment." Aldrin turned to look at Preston Vale, who had approached the bank with the careful gait of someone managing several things at once, his composure, the optics, the narrative of the last 40 minutes, and his own understanding of what had just happened, which was still incomplete. "You know who this is?" Aldrin said to Preston. He said it without hostility but without softness. Preston looked at Daniel. "He's the subcontracted. He designed the vehicle recovery protocols your rescue teams have been running in this region for 6 years," Aldrin said. "The river extraction procedure your marine unit used last spring. The anchor geometry calculation for the bridge recovery after the Cedar Creek flood. That's in his work." Preston said nothing. Nearby, one of Luxon's junior engineers, a young man named Tor who had been with the firm for 14 months and who was currently standing with a tablet displaying the Aurora's telemetry data, cleared his throat. "The failure points match exactly what he told the coordinator at 1140, Tor said. He wasn't looking at Preston. He was looking at the tablet. The soil shear at the lower ramp contact. The grade differential. Both in the pre-event incident log. He showed the tablet to the fire officer in the white hard hat, who read it and nodded. "He tried to tell us," Tor said. "Not as an accusation. As a statement of record. The kind of statement that 24-year-old engineers make when they are not yet experienced enough to know that institutional self-preservation usually wins against accurate data, and are temporarily operating as if truth is sufficient. In this case, there were cameras. There were city officials. There were investors. There was a test driver currently wrapped in a thermal blanket 30 feet away who was alive because a subcontracted facilities technician had rigged a recovery sequence in a truck that everyone at the event had laughed at. Truth, on this occasion, had sufficient witnesses. Daniel was not part of this conversation. He had finished recovering his equipment from the bank, walked back to the truck, and opened the passenger door. Lily was sitting buckled with the orange emergency whistle in her hand, backpack on, homework folder closed and back in its proper place. She looked at him with the wide, clear eyes of a child who has been good under pressure, and knows it, and is waiting to be told so. He checked her hands. Warm. He checked her face for distress. Calm. "You okay?" he asked. "I was watching," she said. "I know. Are you okay?" She considered the question seriously. "The man in the car, he got out?" "He's out. He's okay." She let out a breath. "Good." She handed him the whistle. "I didn't need it." "I know," Daniel said. He put it back in the glove box. He reached behind the seat and adjusted the fleece blanket that had slid to the floor. He handed her the small bag of chips she'd earned 2 hours ago. Then he heard Aldrin behind him and stood up. Preston found him there. He had reconstructed his composure by then, not fully, but enough to walk with purpose and speak in full sentences, which was his baseline for functioning in difficult situations. He had 2 of his senior staff with him, and the kind of expression that comes from preparing a version of events on the walkover. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "on behalf of Luxon Automotive, I want to extend our sincere gratitude for your—" He paused. The word he had prepared was intervention, but it sounded too small. "Your extraordinary response to an unexpected environmental variable that—" "It wasn't an environmental variable," Daniel said. He said it quietly. Not loudly, not with performance. He was leaning slightly against the truck's open door, arms at his sides. Lily was in the passenger seat. He had not asked for an audience, but there was one. The fire officer, Aldrin, Tor with the tablet, 2 city safety officials who had arrived with Aldrin, a cluster of event guests who had stopped moving. "The riverbank condition was visible at 10 o'clock this morning," Daniel said. "The ramp angle was wrong for wet surface contact before anyone ran the car. I raised it with your event coordinator at 1140. I tried the security supervisor twice. I spoke to the fire officer before the demonstration started." He paused. "Your people didn't miss it because it was hard to see. They dismissed it because of who was saying it. That's the part that should concern your company more than the car." Preston's composure held, but only barely. It had the quality of a surface that has been repaired rather than replaced, which is to say it held everywhere except in the eyes. "We will certainly be conducting a thorough internal review. That review needs to include the subcontractor briefing process," Daniel said. The facility's staff and contracted workers on that site had eyes on the setup that your event engineers did not. None of them were in the technical briefing. None of them had a reporting line to anyone with authority to stop the demonstration. He wasn't asking for anything. He was stating conditions. The distinction was apparent to everyone listening. One of the city safety officials, a woman named Carrera, who oversaw event permits for the Riverside district, was writing something in a notebook. She did not look up while Daniel spoke. The driver is alive, Daniel said. That's the part that matters. The rest of this is paperwork. He looked at Preston for one moment, not with contempt, not with satisfaction, just the level look of a man who has said the true thing in front of the people who needed to hear it, and considers that sufficient. Then he turned to Lily. Ready to go? He asked. She zipped her backpack. I want to see the bridge lights before we go home, she said. From the river road. That's on the way, he said. Preston stood where he was. The two staff members beside him exchanged a glance. Tor was already talking to Carrera, pointing at the telemetry data on his tablet. The cameras, which had never really stopped rolling, were still rolling. Several of them were pointed at the truck as it pulled slowly out of the subcontractor lot. Daniel didn't look back. Luxon Automotive suspended Preston Vale from his role pending an internal review, which was announced 5 days after the event in a brief statement that used the phrase, alignment with safety first operational values, 3 times and Preston's name once. The remaining demonstration schedule for the Aurora launch tour was suspended pending independent safety review. The review panel, assembled at the recommendation of city officials and the event permit office, included a structural engineer, a river access safety specialist, and by the firm request of the panel's chair, a field recovery consultant with current regional credentials. Daniel received the consulting offer by email. He read it twice, then set his phone on the kitchen table and made Lily's lunch for the following day. Then he read it again. He replied with 2 conditions. The first, any safety personnel assigned to a Luxon event must have documented authority to halt a demonstration. Not advisory authority. Stopping authority. The difference mattered, and he said so in plain language, and the legal team's revision of the clause confirmed they understood the distinction. The second, subcontracted workers on any site where their work touched a risk boundary must be included in technical briefings, not as observers but as reporting participants with a named contact in the event's authority chain. Luxon's legal department sent back 3 revisions. Daniel accepted the third one. He did not negotiate his fee. He accepted what was offered because the conditions were the point, and the conditions were met, and adding a counteroffer to a principled position would have changed the nature of the position. The correction the company made was not dramatic. It was the kind of correction that organizations make when they have been caught, not comprehensively, not with the full reckoning that the moment might theoretically deserve, but enough to reduce the probability of the same failure in the same way. Which is, in practice, how institutions change. Incrementally, under documented pressure, when the cost of not changing has been made visible and permanent. Daniel knew this. He had worked inside enough systems to understand that partial correction is the most common form of correction, and that accepting it while continuing to push is more productive than refusing it as insufficient. He filed his first consulting report 6 weeks later. It identified 4 additional risk vectors in Luxon's current event infrastructure protocol. He sent it without fanfare. They implemented 2 of the 4 within the quarter. He considered this a reasonable start. The heater rattled, as it always did. It had rattled since the second winter after Mara died, when Daniel had rebuilt most of the truck's electrical systems but had not gotten around to the heater fan bearing, which produced a specific ticking sound at low speeds that he had long since stopped hearing as a problem and started hearing simply as the truck running. Lily had the event badge in her lap, a laminated credential that someone from the media team had pressed into her hands during the aftermath, in the vague generosity that follows disasters. It had her father's name on it under the word facilities. She was studying it with the focused attention she gave small objects that seemed to carry more meaning than their size suggested. "Is the truck famous now?" she asked. Daniel looked at the river road, the lights from the bridge ahead turning the water a soft amber. No. But people saw it. People see lots of things. She turned the badge over. There was a small Luxon logo on the back, gold on black. She ran her thumb across it. Mom would have liked it, she said. The part where it pulled the shiny car out. Daniel was quiet for a moment. The bridge lights came closer, amber and steady, the kind of infrastructure that holds without requiring acknowledgement. Yeah, he said. He rested one hand briefly on the worn steering wheel. The same hand, the same place, the instinctive placement of someone returning to a gesture that belonged to this particular road and this particular end of day. I think she would have. Lily looked out the window at the bridge as they passed under it, the lights sliding overhead, the river dark and moving below. She would have called it a good trick, Lily said. Daniel smiled. Small reel? That sounds about right. The truck moved through the amber light and out the other side into the ordinary darkness of the river road, the heater ticking, the dashboard glowing its familiar green, Mara carrying them home the way she always had, rough on the outside, steady where it counted, holding.